Can we bring up some of these graphics, Matt? I'd like to use, and do you mind, can you indulge me and have this free Lula frame, or it could be any other frame that works better.
It would be hard. Yeah, let's try something that works better, and then the only I'll talk about.
It's fine.
Why.
Use whatever works.
Okay.
Whatever works.
The only reason why is I don't know the actors, and so part of what this tool is like mapping the terrain.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so give me.
But you do know the terrain, so yeah.
No, but that's fine. Go ahead.
Totally.
Take command, because this is. I love this. This is the first time we've had a serious graphic on this show. That isn't some wanky poll thing. I love it.
So this is a tool that we use when we train activists, and it's called the Spectrum of Allies. It's actually called a lot of things. This has been for many decades used.
Can you describe it visually for somebody who's listening versus watching?
I will.
Thank you.
Okay. It's been used at like the Highlander Center that like Dr. King and Rosa Parks studied at. It's been used I learned it from the Ruckus Society. And basically, if you're listening in, it looks like half a pizza pie, basically, where there's like 5 slices. So if you like draw a circle and draw a line in half, if you're listening, it might even be useful to just like draw it on a page of paper if you want. But here's how it works. This is like helps you map the terrain if you're building a campaign or assessing movement strategy. And there's multiple applications. So on the left wedge, those are your active allies. So that's where you would map and list all the institutions, all the social blocks or key individuals that on your issue that you're fighting on are on your side and actively fighting, right? So that might be allied organizations, that might be your own base, etc. Then next is your passive allies. These are people who agree with you, but they're not taking action.
So you're watching on YouTube, but you haven't gone to patreon.com/TMBS. Get the fuck on it.
Yeah.
All right, I get it. I can use this pizza pie.
Yeah, take action.
All right.
I am a patron. Join me.
Indeed. There you go.
So your passive allies don't need to read your like newspaper.
Right.
They already agree with you. What they need is a doorway into action. They need a credible plan that they can see themselves a part of, right? They need a pathway and an opportunity to take action, right? Next is your neutrals. Those are our favorite fence sitters or people who don't know or don't care or are ambivalent. Then is the passive opposition.
Can I ask a real question?
Yeah.
How relevant is it to distinguish inside the neutrals between a don't care versus a don't know or like genuinely conflicted? Because it seems to me those are 3 really different things.
Yeah. Okay. I'll get to it more.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But one of the things about the neutrals is that's a category that when you're building a strategy, a lot of your I don't know goes here. And you then identify which neutrals matter to figure out. So one of the many ways that you use this tool is it lets you know what research to do in order to do a campaign.
Got it.
But let's talk more about that. So then is your passive opposition. These are people who are against you, but they're not actively trying to out-organize you and are mostly just noise, right? And so a lot of activists get really distracted by their passive opposition, not realizing that their passive opposition isn't in an institutional position to stop them, right? And then finally is your active opposition. These are the people who are actively organizing against you, or they are power holders trying to maintain their power and stop you, yeah? And so another mistake activists make is they either hang out in the active allies category and just talk to themselves, right? And don't think about anybody else. Or they act like everyone is in the active opposition, which, like when I mentioned like the war in Iraq, like when I was marching in the streets with, hundreds of thousands of students, we were chanting and screaming as if everyone was George Bush, not realizing that most of the country was actually like shell shocked and in trauma from 9/11 and didn't know what to think and was highly influenceable and believed in weapons of mass destruction. We weren't talking to them at all. We were like just yelling at our active opposition, right? So what this tool helps you do is helps you map a campaign by getting really specific. I hear activists all the time saying like, we can't do this because it would alienate the public, or how do we reach the public? There is no the public. There's only a balance of forces in society that you can actually map, and that by literally putting this on the wall and doing this, you find out what you know and what you don't know, and you figure out who has the power. So I'll give one historical case study, and then we can play with an example and maybe talk about Lula. So before we go to the second graphic, what's the exact? So let's talk about SNCC. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was the engine of the early civil rights movement in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And in the very early 60s, they were organizing a campaign that was registering black voters in the South. And they were experiencing extreme violence. They were experiencing lynchings. They were getting jailed. They were getting beaten. And they busted out a chart basically like this. And they mapped out, okay, we've exhausted the capacity of our base down here in Mississippi. We can't, there's no more muscle to flex. We're flexing our muscle as much as possible. And when they mapped it out, they said, all right, there's university students in the North who are like mad passive allies. Like they agree with us, they're down, they don't need to be like convinced, but they don't have any way to support us. Right. So we're going to do a campaign called Freedom Summer, where we send buses up to the North and students, mixed race students, black students and white students, although the white ones are mostly Jewish. Yeah.
You hear that, guys? You hear that? That's right. Thank you, Joshua.
Came down to the South. Yeah. Right. And spent the summer engaging in that struggle. And a lot of those white students, for the first time in their lives, had their eyes opened to the realities of white mob violence, of KKK infiltration of the police, and a lot of them themselves were getting brutalized. Yep. And so that was one way that you created this pathway from passive allies to active allies, right? Then what happened was a lot of those students wrote letters home to mom and dad, and a lot of their parents had personal connection to the struggle suddenly, and could experience not just empathy, but also those parents were part of social institutions. They were part of PTAs, they were part of unions, they were part of professional associations, they were part of sewing circles. Right. And many of those were either, neutral or apolitical, and because of the personal connection could get politicized and move from neutral to passive allies. Or some of them were even passive opposition, and it humanized an experience of not thinking like the Black South, like it was, some foreign country or something like that, and brought it home in a different kind of way. And there were shifts from passive opposition to neutral. And so if you go to the next graphic, if you're listening in, you see just a bunch of arrows shifting all of these blocks to the left. And so the lesson here is that in movements often don't win by like going directly after the active opposition and beating and overpowering it, but by shifting the support out from under it, by assessing where are the social blocks in society and getting them to move one square to the left. And it helps us think about strategy because we don't necessarily need every single one of these groups to shift all the way into active allies, right? If we can get each of them to shift one to the left, it builds our base, which means we have muscle to flex, which means we can contest for power. And it means the active opposition gets out of the way so that the active opposition doesn't have a resource to draw from and they get isolated. And in doing so, you create this cascading waterfall of support, and you don't need to focus on convincing someone far to your right to join your position, and you don't need to get all pissed off if they're not all the way on your side. Right. Because if you get MoveOn.org, like radicals talk about how centrist MoveOn is and how they're not really on our team and they've co-opted blah 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 whatever. You don't need MoveOn to become like a self-identified revolutionary organization. If you can organize in a way that shifts them one to the left, you then create a different balance of forces in the country, which is what, for example, like this latest cohort of new congresswomen are doing. Right. It helps you think about engaging institutions like the Democratic Party in a strategic way, where you're thinking about how do we shape our terrain so that it's on our side. So do you want to play a game with it, or do you want to talk about Lula?
Well, I want to play. We could play. No, I mean that's actually great. Maybe we'll do Lula on the post game. But I do want. I want to underline it because I think there's maybe some relevance in how this Venezuela thing has been going. Yeah. And I just want to say specifically, you see this process with Chris Murphy. He's a great example because you have this. I mean, first you have probably most people in the country are neutral. There's a fair amount passive opposition. And then there's a fair amount of passive allies because they just don't want more U.S. engagement. They don't want any more troops, frankly, to die for any type of stupid foreign adventure, whatever it may be. When people on the left constructively pushed, and Ro Khanna, to his credit, was the first one that came out and said, we should not do this, right? And then, and then because he did that, and then Ilhan Omar, she was very strong, and then, AOC kind of went there, and Bernie kind of went there. But what really hit me was when Chris Murphy, who's been great on Yemen, but he's definitely, he is a liberal versus these other politicians trying to occupy a more sort of social democratic space. He did that tweet thread on the problem with the caravan. And I don't know if you caught that, but it was very, it was very modulated language, but he was like, all right, guys. He even said, like, let's think about this for a second. Let's see what the trouble this might get us into, even if it's well-intentioned. Mm-hmm. And when I saw that, I definitely was like, whoa, we are really, like, that's terrain shifting. Now, obviously, because of the institutional arrangement, Rubio and Trump and Bolton and, these ghouls are going to keep pushing for this. But would that be the kind of example that you're talking about?
Yeah. And it allows you to declare that as a victory. Right. And because there's this problem that social movements have where, like, we have trouble declaring victory when we get it because it's not perfect. Right. And on the other hand, sometimes declaring a victory when it's not complete does pull oxygen out of a movement. We experienced this on Keystone XL where, like, we experienced a real defeat. It was a partial victory. We were not sure how to call it. And some of the energy dissipated by trying to celebrate a victory, but some of the energy might have dissipated by not celebrate, and having an orientation towards this, at least with your base, allows you to see, okay, them moving, it is a victory because it changes the terrain, not because it's sufficient, and it allows you to see yourself on a pathway. But you can only see yourself on the pathway if you have a North Star, if you have vision, Yeah.
In the last couple of minutes before we go to the postgame, and you will stay with us for the postgame.
Sure. Yep.
Please, if you can. How does this relate to the exiting the Vampire Castle stuff and dealing with all of the problems inside the culture of the left? And again, I don't usually some of these things manifest as like Marxist versus identity and all this stuff, and again, I'll sound like, Bill Clinton. I don't buy these false categories. Like, I think it's obviously these are integrated and interdependent process, but I do see across the board, and I'm sure I've made plenty of mistakes myself, really, really toxic, really, really moralizing, and sometimes even like cultish subcultures, which are creating unhealthy internal cultures, and also, I think, even undermining their own processes of people actually being able to have the space to do the work on themselves, to become the kind of people that these movements might want us to be. Because if everything is constantly, a call out and so on, then, well, you just have to, I've got to pretend that I'm perfect. And of course nobody is. So, like, how does this relate to the Vampire Castle stuff? What's your kind of perspective on that?
Yeah, this gets to the heart of what the Wildfire Project's work is around helping heal movement cultures. I actually don't know the Vampire Castle reference.
Oh, I'll send that to you. I'm sorry. It's a Mark Fisher essay called Exiting the Vampire Castle. Unfortunately, he took his life several years ago. But it's it's basically is about the kind of toxicity of online left stuff, basically. But
yeah, it's there's one of the things we've talked about before is, like, if you don't have an arena where you feel like you can exercise power, you're going to exercise power in whatever way you can, including punching the person next to you in the meeting because you disagree with them a little bit.
Right.
I liked what you were saying earlier in the show about buzzword signifiers, and to me, part of what we're talking about here, like, this is kind of a populist tool in a way, right?
Yep.
And one of the key things that we're challenged with in social movements is defining the we, like, who's the us and who's the them, right?
Right.
And which is, you had mentioned earlier talking about the role of, like, consciousness or political education in social movements. And if you define the we, the us, so small that it's only your little subculture, you're going to zoom in on the wrong things and fight each other over the purity of politics and build the circular firing squads of call out culture. If you define the we so big, you have no compass whatsoever.
Right.
And
then you don't protect your own people, and you don't, because again, it's it's not like just forget about it, just do whatever. It is a dialectic, like you're saying.
Exactly.
Right.
And politics are about having a material analysis to assess your terrain, because your choices. So, for example, when Beto was running in Texas, I was so excited.
Right. Absolutely.
Because that would both take obviously a crack at the Republican establishment if he were able to win. It'd also take a crack at the Democratic establishment because he was much more progressive than centrists believe is possible to win in a red state, and it breaks that formula.
Right.
And so him winning in Texas moves our objectives forward. Beto running in the national election is against our objectives. It undermines our objectives. He's the same guy. Right? So if your politics are just this individual, like, I don't know, whatever, Jimmy Dore, like kind of like, oh, I'm just going to get, did I hit a hot button?
Love it.
We could, talk
Joshua Kahn's a fucking sellout.
Like
the Wildfire Project, I don't know, it's a lot of fishy stuff that they're doing rent strikes, but they didn't say a fucking thing about Tulsi Gabbard.
I'm suspect of that. This is that to me, this is red flaggy all over the place.
Red flaggy. Yeah. So if you're zoomed into like whether Beto is like, if it's about Beto, you have no political compass, right?
Right.
But if you have a map of the terrain, then you're like, like actually just to say another thing about Jimmy Dore to kind of land it, which was, it's a good example of why you need political education and consciousness and movements, because when he, like in the 2016 primary, when he was raging against Hillary, I was like, yeah, this guy is funny. This is like, I loved his show. Right. And
definitely,
it was hilarious. And he was like pissed. I was like, here's a liberal who's starting to move to a radical politic because he's becoming disillusioned with the Democratic Party. Right. And like, that's the appropriate time to rage against Hillary. Then when the general election starts and the candidate is Hillary, your option is to choose your battlefield, and I choose the Hillary battlefield.
Right.
And if you can't make that distinction, it's because you're not assessing the terrain, and you don't have a view. Like, I was like, oh, this dude's just getting so upset about the Democratic Party because he feels betrayed by them.
Right.
I don't feel betrayed by the Democratic Party because I don't feel a part of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, well, when were we friends to begin with?
Yeah.
They're the fucking Democratic Party.
Yeah. So
they
instead,
are a corporate, capital-driven, imperial-minded institution that I have to wrestle with because of the institutional realities of modern America.
And so what you're doing then is looking at the Democratic Party as a site of struggle that is not a monolith, that has avenues where we can shift folks over, and is the institutional terrain that we're on, and has real barriers. And then you play the field, and you look at it as a playing field, not as like who's like righteous, and because they're fundamentally not on our team, even if we're choosing to engage that vehicle, and even if we have team members on the field wearing their jerseys, which we do.
Right.
And so that's, I don't know if that gets
no, that's really, I think I think that runs the terrain. That's perfect. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.